Okay, I'll just have to do... Yeah, so as you can see I've got my smoking experiment going. I'm not really sure what the hell I'm doing, to be honest. Because I'm a fucking idiot, I touched the pipe there to see if it was hot, and of course it was, so yeah. Lesson learned, well deserved. Okay, some of you may remember the Tales from the Eldritch North thing that I did on YouTube a while back, last winter I guess. Mr. Haukenes and his excellent Kvinnherad book, which chronicles a lot of the folklore of the Hardanger and Kvinnherad sort of region. I know that you guys love stories about the Huldra folk a lot, as do I. And this region actually is full of stories about the hidden folk. In that YouTube clip I talked about how the Norwegian variety of the fair folk, the fairies, the hidden people, the Huldra, is a little bit more malevolent than its Icelandic cousin. And I think also perhaps what we see in Denmark, maybe, I don't know about Sweden, but certainly it's more like we find in Ireland sometimes, where it's like the Huldra people can be both good or bad news, usually bad news. You have to be very wary around them. A lot of these stories are cautionary tales about how to deal with the Huldra folk if you absolutely, positively have to deal with them at all. The most common attributes of the Huldra people in Norwegian folklore is that they are lusty and they're jealous, mischievous. They're not really evil per se. They have some of the worst human qualities and occasionally some of the best, but it's kind of amplified. So they are great fiddlers. They look extremely attractive, or they can make themselves look attractive, though they are usually terribly ugly. They're very passionate. They're angry and they're joyous and everything in the human condition, just plus one. But they're kind of miserable, and they lust after the young, especially young women in the courtship phase of their life are at risk of attracting the attention of the Huldra folk, and especially brides-to-be. If somebody's about to get married, you have to be very careful not to let the Huldra people get your bride. Up until the wedding itself, there's a risk that the Huldra people will actually steal the bride and take her into the mountain with them. We call this bergtaking in Norwegian, which literally means mountain taking, a kidnapping into the mountain or taken into the underworld in a way. Here's a story from kind of the region, a little bit east of where I am right now. So, there was a bridegroom who wanted to go out hunting. Because he was about to get married, he didn't want the hidden people to take his bride, so he brought her with him. So what they did is they ventured further and further out into the wilderness until suddenly it started getting dark. Too dark, in fact, for them to return, so they had to spend the night up in the mountain. So out of fear of losing his girlfriend to the hidden people, he took her braids and he tied them to his arm. When he woke up the next morning, he found that the braids were still there, but his bride was not. So the Huldra folk had actually come up to them in the dead of night, cut off her hair, and taken her to the mountain with them. And there's something about braids and marriage, some sort of like rite of passage that is alluded to in the folklore sometimes. It's not always very clear what it is, but there seems to have been some sort of like ritual haircut of pleated hair in Scandinavian pre-industrial society or even prehistory. There are stray finds in Danish bogs, for instance, of pleated hair, and there are references to the practice of cutting the virgin pleats and stuff like that in folk songs. Also, actually, about marriages with the hidden people. Anyway, that's a bit of a digression. So this guy, of course, you know, he's out of his mind with sorrow. He doesn't know quite what to do, so he returns to his family and tells them what happened. So they figure that they have to go out into the mountain range and try to get his bride back. Okay, so it turns out that my camera health was not quite as good as I thought it was. Anyway. But in the end, he went out into the wilderness with his brother, where they finally chanced upon a farm and heard sounds of merrymaking inside. They snuck up to one of the windows and saw that his bride indeed was sitting in the high seat, about to be married to another groom of the Huldra people. So he cocked his rifle and put it up there in the window and shot the Huldra man's nose clean off. But the bullet went straight past and shot a piece of her bridal crown off as well. He saved the girl and took the bridal crown as well. And this is where the story reveals itself to be kind of the origin myth of some artifact that was probably passed around in Kvinnherad or belonged to a family there. Bridal crowns are a feature of pre-industrial Norwegian marriage ceremonies, where the brides would actually wear these very elaborate and beautiful crowns at their wedding feast. So the story alleges that this is a true, supernatural artifact, because no goldsmith could ever get, the piece that had fallen off to fit back on the crown. In other cases, legends about the Huldra people are basically there to educate people about proper etiquette. There's one legend about 8 Huldra people approaching a farm asking for bread. The mother of the house thought that these were just, riffraff, poor people. "What, don't you have any bread at home?" she says. "Well, you might say that we have everything but bread," the Huldra people say. "And don't worry, if you give us a little bit of bread, we'll give you plenty of grain and hay and other things you might need." The mother of the house goes, "Well, if that's true, why don't you come back in the fall and I'll give you some bread?" The Huldra people get angry and say, "Then you're going to have to do without milk and hay and grain and meat." And then the lady of the house realizes, "Wait, are you Huldra people?" "That we are," they say, and vanish before her eyes. The family immediately realizes what they've done. And after that, they were always a lot nicer to the poor folk. And ever since, there's been no lack of milk or grain or pork at this farm. A lot of the stories deal with the generosity of the Huldra folk if you help them out. This story is about a wedding. And as any wedding, there's a lot of dancing and fiddling and that sort of stuff. And in the middle of the dance, a beautiful girl appeared and started dancing with the other revelers at the wedding. She danced so well that everybody wondered who she could be. But at some point, when she bent over, one of the boys noticed a cow's tail poking down under her skirts. He went over to her and whispered in her ear that her cow's tail was visible. The girl immediately vanished, but the boy who warned her that her tail was visible always had great luck and wealth. I'm sure some of you have read the article that I put up on brutenorse.com about fiddling traditions and superstitions in Norway. And here's another story about such a jig that was taught to a fiddler by the Huldra folk. So an old fiddler was walking around in Kvinnherad late one evening and then sat down by a mound to play a jig. But just as he started playing, he heard another jig playing inside the mound itself. It was a jig he'd never heard before, but very good. And when it was over, he tried to play a little bit of it himself by ear. And just then, a bunch of people came out of the mound and invited him in, where he learned the jig completely. He didn't tell anybody about this jig, nor did he play it in public, until he came to a party much, much later and played the jig for those present. And when he played it, both the people and the tables and the benches and everything that was in that cabin began to dance. It only lasted a moment, because as soon as he noticed, he stopped playing. And ever since, he never played the jig again. The one who told this story was an old man, who claims that his mother participated in this party. Though she was very young, she remembers it well. This motif is actually found also in Icelandic sagas, and it's a story you find sometimes attached to particularly talented fiddlers and associated with certain renowned fiddling jigs that are either supposed to have originated with the hidden people or have been taught by the devil himself. Another story goes about a boy who was found shambling down the mountainside, and he was both crooked and unable to speak. One of the more educated men of the village took him back up from whence he came, and immediately he started getting a lot better. Well enough, in fact, to explain what had happened to him. He had been herding sheep up in the mountains and gone to sleep up in the mountainside. No sooner had he lain down before he saw some girls dancing loosely a little bit further up. They were a little bit old in the face, but otherwise their figure was good and they were rather nice to look at. They wore blue skirts and white shirts, and their braids went down to their asses below their headscarves. That's when he noticed a cow's tail poking out from under the hem of the skirt. He thought that this was so strange that he couldn't help but laugh. But when one of the Huldra girls heard this, she walked up to him and clocked him in the face. Immediately after, he was crooked and lost his speech. The story notes that he later became a boat builder and died at sea. As you can tell from these stories, it is important to be on good terms with the hidden people, even if you do not want to deal with them too often or too directly.